Hey guys, this is Scott with Coffee with Scott, and I want us for just a little while to look at some scriptures together. Yesterday in the Sabbath, my pastor taught or preached a message called The Anointed Mind. And I got to thinking about a couple of different things, and the verse that popped into my mind was Acts 26:2. Where the apostle says, as he is in chains, as he is imprisoned, he's going to stand before King Agrippa. And King Agrippa is going to tell him, he's going to say, Paul, I'm going to allow you to speak for yourself. And the scriptures tell us that Paul stretched out his hand and answered for himself. I want you to think about that for a minute. Paul answered for himself. And I guess I want to stop there and just say, you and I can't answer for anybody else. We have to give an answer for ourselves. And I want you to think about the first couple of words. When Agrippa says to the Apostle Paul, I'm going to allow you to speak for yourself. Because you see, he had been accused by the Jews of different things. And so Agrippa says, I want to hear from you, Paul. I want you to speak for yourself. I want you to think of the first four words that Paul says. He stretches out his hand and he says, I think myself happy. I think myself happy. And I want us to look at a couple of words there. This word think means to deem. So Paul says, King Agrippa, I deem myself happy. This word means to consider. So Paul says, King Agrippa, I consider myself happy. I think myself happy. Now you consider what Paul, the Apostle Paul, had been through. What he had dealt with. And he says to King Agrippa, I think myself happy. This word happy means to be made happy, to be happy. But if we look deeper, the Hebrew equivalent to this word means to be called blessed. It means to be made happy. So Paul says, I'm blessed. King Agrippa, I consider myself blessed. I consider myself happy. But not only does this Hebrew equivalent to this word mean to be considered blessed or to be made happy, but it means to go straight. It means to advance forward. So I want us, as we keep those thoughts in our mind, those thoughts in the forefront of our mind, that the apostle says, I consider myself blessed. I consider myself happy. I consider myself that I'm going to keep on going forward. I consider myself that I consider myself I am going to keep going straight. And I want us to look at a couple of other scriptures as we think about these things, this thought, or this declaration. Let me say it this way, this declaration that the Apostle Paul made to King Agrippa on that day as he is in chains. He is in prison. He is no longer a free person. And he says, I'm going to keep moving forward. That's at the meat. I believe at the meat of what Paul says that day as he stands before King Agrippa. That's really what he is saying. I'm going to keep going forward. I'm going to keep advancing because I'm blessed. I've called myself. I think myself to be blessed. And I want you to listen to Paul's testimony. In 2 Corinthians 11, starting at verse 25, he says, "Thrice was I beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. Thrice I suffered shipwreck. A night and a day have I been in the deep. In journeyings often, in perils of waters, in perils of robbers, in perils of mine own countrymen, in perils by the heathen, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren, in weariness and painfulness, in watchings often, in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, in cold and in nakedness, beside those things that are without. That which cometh upon me daily, the care of the assemblies, the congregation." And then Paul says, "Who is weak? And I am not weak? Who is offended? And I burn not?" And then Paul says, "If I must needs glory, I will glory of the things which concern mine infirmities." And Paul says, "I consider myself blessed." He hadn't gone through all of this yet. He'd already been through some of this. But when he stands before Agrippa, he says, "I think and consider myself blessed." I want us to go and look at Romans 8. In verse 35 is where we're going to start. So you and I have reason to consider ourselves blessed, to think ourselves happy. This is also from the Apostle Paul. In Romans 8 and 35, this is what Paul says. This is the question that Paul asks. "Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? So tribulation, or distress, or persecution, or famine, or nakedness, or peril, or sword? As it is written, for thy sake we are killed all the day long. We are counted as sheep for the slaughter. Nay, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him that loved us." And Paul says, "For I am persuaded that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor powers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor height, nor depth, nor any other creature," listen closely to what the Apostle Paul says, "shall be able to separate us from the love of God, which is in Messiah Yeshua, our Lord." Nothing shall be able to separate us from the love of God. And we're going to look at this word that Paul uses for separate. This word means to divide, to part, to put asunder, to be made to depart. It means to place a room between. And all of these things that the Apostle Paul says, all these things that the Apostle Paul has went through and will continue to go through, all the things he's dealt with, as he writes to the Romans, he says, nothing shall cause there to be a space, a room, a gap between us and the love of God. Paul's knowledge of this Paul's understanding of these things allowed him to stand before Agrippa in chains, and knowing his fate. And he says, I think myself happy. I consider myself to be blessed. My friend, you and I today have no reason not to consider ourselves happy. We have no reason not to consider ourselves blessed.